The way she said waste felt heavier than the porcelain cup between my hands. Rain traced down the cafe window beside our table, each droplet catching the amber light from the sconces overhead. I had ordered a small pot of Earl Grey and a lemon tart, nothing extravagant, just something warm on a Tuesday afternoon when the October chill had settled into my bones like an unwelcome guest that planned to stay through winter. "Stop wasting money on yourself," my daughter Sarah said, her voice cutting through the gentle murmur of conversation around us. She didn't look up from her phone as she spoke, fingers moving across the screen with the efficiency of someone half her age. At 42, she had perfected the art of multitasking disapproval, delivering criticism while simultaneously managing her children's schedules, her husband's travel itinerary, and what appeared to be a heated text exchange with someone whose urgency superseded our afternoon together. I set the cup down carefully, the way my mother had taught me, no clink against the saucer, no unnecessary noise. The tart sat untouched on its small white plate, the glaze now seeming too bright, too indulgent, like evidence of some character flaw I hadn't known I possessed. Through the window, I watched a woman my age hurry past, her coat pulled tight against the wind. She moved with purpose, her steps quick and sure, her face turned towards some destination that belonged entirely to her. I envied her direction, her obvious ownership of her own afternoon. "The money you spend on these little outings could go towards something useful," Sarah continued, finally looking up. Her eyes, my eyes, the same shade of green that had once been called pretty by young men who saw potential rather than burden, held no warmth. "Timothy needs new soccer cleats. The mortgage payment is coming up. And here you are, ordering tea that costs more than a week's worth of groceries." I wanted to tell her that the tea cost $4.50. That my little outings happened perhaps twice a month, and usually consisted of sitting in this same corner booth with a book I'd checked out from the library. That I had spent the last 22 years of my marriage ensuring her father had his whiskey money, that she had her college tuition, that everyone's needs were met before I even considered my own. Instead, I reached for my purse, the same black leather bag I'd carried for 6 years, practical and unremarkable, and placed exact change on the table. The coins made small metallic sounds against the wooden surface, punctuating the conversation with the arithmetic of acquiescence. A $5 bill, 4 quarters, 2 dimes. The mathematics of a life lived in increments small enough to avoid notice, reasonable enough to escape criticism. "You're right," I said, though the words felt like swallowing glass. "I should be more careful." Sarah's expression softened slightly, the way it did when she thought she'd won something important rather than simply worn down an opponent who had stopped fighting years ago. "I just worry about your finances, Mom. Dad always said you were too generous for your own good." Asterisk Dad always said. Asterisk even now, 8 months after the funeral, she wielded his opinions like a shield against any conversation that might require her to see me as something other than a collection of problems requiring her management. Richard had indeed said I was too generous, usually while explaining why his golf membership was essential, while my book club dues were frivolous. He had said many things over our 37 years of marriage, most of them wrapped in the kind of logic that left no room for argument and no space for alternatives. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the glass, each drop following the path of the one before it in streams that looked like tears but carried no emotion. I stood, leaving the tart untouched, and gathered my coat. The weight of Sarah's approval felt heavier than disappointment, more suffocating than anger. As we walked to our cars in silence, our footsteps echoing against the wet pavement, I realized something had shifted in the space between her words and my acquiescence. Not anger, anger was too loud, too chaotic, too recognizable as something that might demand response. Something quieter. Something that tasted like the Earl Grey I hadn't finished, complex and slightly bitter and somehow familiar. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee, cheaper, more practical, the kind of choice that would meet with universal approval, and stared at the calendar on the wall. October stretched ahead in neat little squares, each day unmarked except for the monthly pension deposit notation on the 15th. I had been 68 years old for 4 months now, and I could count on one hand the number of decisions I had made without consulting someone else's budget, someone else's opinion, someone else's needs. I opened my checkbook and ran my finger down the modest entries, each one recorded in the careful script I'd learned in secretarial school 50 years ago. Groceries, utilities, car payment, insurance. Small automatic transfers to Sarah's children's savings accounts, transfers she had suggested, of course, for their future education. Nothing wasteful. Nothing indulgent. Nothing that belonged only to me, that served no purpose beyond my own pleasure or curiosity or simple desire to possess something beautiful. The clock on the stove read 11:47 p.m. when I finally understood what had been settling in my chest all afternoon, growing heavier with each hour that passed. It wasn't shame about the tea or guilt about the tart. It was recognition. The kind that comes when you finally see the shape of something that has been growing in the dark for years, fed by small compromises and quiet surrenders until it becomes large enough to have its own weight, its own gravitational pull. It took only 10 days to unlearn 40 years of obedience. I whispered the words aloud to my empty kitchen, testing their weight against the silence. 10 days. That's what it would take to quietly rearrange the foundation of my life. Not demolish, repair. Not destroy, restore. 10 days to remember that I had hands capable of signing my own name, a mind trained in bookkeeping from my years at the county clerk's office, and a pension that, while modest, belonged entirely to me. 10 days to practice the radical act of living deliberately rather than accidentally, of choosing rather than simply accepting whatever space was left over after everyone else's needs had been accommodated. The first day would be for lists, not the kind I usually made, tracking other people's schedules and obligations, but lists that belonged to me. The second for the bank, where I would speak in my own voice about my own money. The third for changing locks, not because I feared intrusion but because I wanted to practice the feeling of being the only one who decided who came in. By the 10th day, I would know the exact sound my dignity made when it finally found its voice. I poured the instant coffee down the drain and put the kettle on. Some decisions required proper tea, the kind that came from leaves rather than bags, that demanded patience and attention and the small ceremony of doing something well rather than simply efficiently. The steam from my cup caught the morning light as I spread my pension statements across the dining room table. 43 years of work, first as a secretary at the elementary school where I learned that competence was often invisible and always underpaid, then 15 years keeping books for Dr. Chen's dental practice after the children were grown. Numbers had always made sense to me, their honesty refreshing after a day of managing other people's emotions, their reliability a counterpoint to the constantly shifting expectations of family life. The arithmetic of respect, I decided, was surprisingly simple. I opened a fresh notebook, the kind with graph paper that I used to buy for Sarah's math classes, before I learned that helping with homework was somehow enabling rather than nurturing, and wrote at the top of the first page, things I no longer owe. The phrase felt dangerous even as I wrote it, each letter forming slowly under my careful pen. For 68 years, I had been accumulating debts that had no dollar amounts attached to them, obligations that compounded annually without ever being paid down. The debt of gratitude for being allowed to exist. The debt of apology for taking up space. The debt of justification for every small pleasure, every personal choice, every moment spent on something that served no one but myself. I no longer owe apologies for spending my own money on things that bring me joy. I no longer owe explanations for my choices to people who never asked what I wanted. I no longer owe my silence when someone calls my happiness wasteful. I no longer owe anyone access to my bank account, my daily schedule, or my reasons for saying no. I no longer owe my presence at gatherings where I am treated as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be valued. I no longer owe my agreement with opinions that diminish my worth or discount my experience. The list grew to fill the entire page, each line written in the careful script my third-grade teacher had insisted upon, each statement a small revolution disguised as penmanship practice. Love without boundaries, I realized as I reached the bottom of the page, wasn't love at all. It was unpaid labor, dressed up in duty and served with a side of guilt, seasoned with the constant reminder that asking for anything in return was selfish. I had learned to balance household budgets by the time I was 25, could stretch $1 until it screamed and make a week's worth of meals from leftovers that other families would have thrown away. But I had never learned to balance my own needs against everyone else's demands. The ledger of my life showed decades of giving without accounting for what I might require in return. Not money, that was too simple, too crude a measurement. Respect. Choice. The right to order tea without commentary. The freedom to exist without constantly calculating the cost to everyone else's comfort. I walked to the bathroom mirror and looked at myself directly for the first time in months. Gray hair cut sensibly short by a beautician who charged $30 and never asked if I wanted to try something different. Green eyes that still held their color despite the lines around them, lines earned through 40 years of squinting at other people's problems and trying to see solutions that would satisfy everyone. A face that had spent 68 years adjusting its expression to accommodate other people's moods, reading the emotional weather and dressing accordingly. I had been told I was pretty once, back when prettiness was measured by how little trouble you caused, how well you anticipated other people's needs, how successfully you made yourself useful without being demanding. Pretty like a piece of furniture that complemented the room without overwhelming it, that served its function without calling attention to itself. Love without boundaries is just unpaid labor, I said to my reflection, watching my mouth form the words that had been swimming in my consciousness for weeks. They sounded different spoken aloud, more solid than they had looked on paper. True in a way that felt dangerous, like standing too close to the edge of something high and discovering that you weren't afraid of falling. I returned to the kitchen and made a second list, this one practical, bank. Locksmith. Resume. Storage boxes. Each item represented a small revolution that no one else would notice until it was complete. The quiet rebellion of a woman who had spent 40 years accommodating and was ready to practice the radical act of living for herself, making choices based on her own preferences rather than other people's fears. The third morning brought the locksmith, a young man named Marcus who arrived promptly at 8 in a truck that smelled like coffee and carried the efficient chaos of someone who solved problems for a living. He worked with the easy competence of someone who understood that changing locks was sometimes about more than security, that people had their reasons and those reasons weren't his business to judge. Quality locks, he said, testing the smooth turn of the new key between fingers that bore the small scars of 30 years working with metal and machinery. These'll last you decades if you treat them right. Dignity sounds a lot like the click of a new lock. I made him a cup of coffee, the good coffee I had been saving for company that never came, keeping it fresh in the freezer while serving instant to myself, and watched him work. His competence was soothing, the way he measured twice and cut once, the care he took to clean up each metal shaving from my floor. When he handed me the keys, warm from the friction of fitting, I felt something shift in my chest. The weight of them in my palm was different from the old keys, heavier somehow, as if they carried the substance of decision rather than mere function. First time changing locks? He asked, packing his tools with the methodical precision of someone who knew where everything belonged. First time choosing who gets to come in, I said, surprising myself with the honesty. He smiled, an expression that suggested he'd heard similar admissions before. Good for you. A woman should control her own front door. After he left, I walked through each room of the house, turning the new locks from inside. The sound echoed differently than it had before, not the loose rattle of hardware that had endured decades of use, but something crisp and deliberate, like punctuation at the end of a sentence that finally said what it meant. I had changed the locks not to keep anyone out, but to practice the feeling of being the only one who decided who came in. The distinction felt enormous, the difference between defense and choice, between hiding and simply claiming space. That afternoon, I drove to First National Bank and requested a meeting with Patricia, the account manager who had been handling my finances since Richard's death. Patricia was perhaps 50, with prematurely silver hair and the kind of careful professionalism that suggested she had learned to take older women seriously, had perhaps watched her own mother navigate the particular challenges of widowhood in a world that assumed women her age were incapable of financial decision-making. "I'd like to establish a small trust," I said, settling into the chair across from her desk. The office smelled like coffee and paper and the particular efficiency of people who spent their days helping other people organize their futures. Nothing complicated. A fund for myself and future charitable contributions. Of course, Mrs. Davidson. That's very wise planning. She pulled out a folder thick with forms and began arranging them with the practiced ease of someone who knew that paperwork was just the visible part of much larger decisions. "Would you like to include any family members as co-signers or beneficiaries?" I had rehearsed this moment during the drive over, practicing the words until they felt natural rather than revolutionary. But the actual speaking still felt foreign in my mouth, like a language I had been learning in secret and was finally ready to use in public. "This will be solely in my name." Patricia nodded as if I had said something perfectly reasonable, which perhaps I had. We spent the next hour reviewing documents that would give me complete control over a portion of my pension and the small life insurance payout from Richard's policy. Not enough money to inspire jealousy or concern, but sufficient to fund a different kind of life if I was careful with it, if I learned to distinguish between what I wanted and what other people thought I should want. The forms required signatures in multiple places, each one feeling like a small act of claiming ownership over my own existence. I signed my maiden name for the first time in 40 years, Helen Margaret Walsh Davidson, the full legal name that included the parts of myself I had been before I became someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's problem to solve. "Some signatures sound like wings unfolding," I murmured as I signed the final document, the pen moving smoothly across paper that smelled faintly of legal importance and the possibility of futures that hadn't been predetermined by other people's expectations. "I'm sorry?" Patricia looked up from her notes, her expression curious rather than concerned. "Nothing important," I said, though it felt like the most important thing I had said in years. "Thank you for your help." I drove home slowly, taking the long way past the cafe where this had all begun. The same corner table was occupied by a young couple sharing a plate of pastries, their conversation animated by the kind of energy that comes from having more future than past, more possibilities than regrets. I didn't feel envious exactly, but I did feel curious about what it might be like to sit at that table again, to order what I wanted without calculating the cost in anyone else's approval, without hearing my daughter's voice cataloging the better uses for $4.50. The phone was ringing when I unlocked my front door, the new deadbolt turning with satisfying precision, the click echoing through the hallway like a small declaration of independence. I let it ring while I hung up my coat and put the kettle on, allowing myself the luxury of arriving home at my own pace rather than rushing to accommodate someone else's urgency. Sarah's voice filled the kitchen as the answering machine clicked on, her words sharp with the particular frustration of someone accustomed to immediate response. "Mom, I've been thinking about what we discussed yesterday. Maybe we should look at your monthly expenses together, create a better budget. I could come by this afternoon around 4. We really need to talk about your spending." I listened to her words while I measured loose-leaf tea into my pot, Earl Grey, the good kind that came in tins rather than bags, that required patience and proper water temperature and the small ceremony of doing something well rather than simply efficiently. We really need to talk. The royal we of family management, the assumption that my finances were a group project requiring her oversight, that my choices were somehow community property subject to collective revision. I deleted the message without returning the call and carried my tea to the living room window, where the afternoon light turned everything soft and golden. The freedom to not answer the phone, to not justify my absence or explain my delay, felt almost dizzying. For 40 years, I had been available for other people's emergencies, crises, and simple inconveniences. The possibility of being unavailable, of having my own schedule that didn't automatically bend to accommodate everyone else's needs, was still so new it felt like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. At exactly 4 o'clock, Sarah knocked on my front door. The new locks meant she couldn't use her key, a detail I hadn't mentioned when I'd failed to return her call, a small revolution disguised as home maintenance. I opened the door wearing my best cardigan and a calm expression that I had been practicing in mirrors all week, the face of a woman who was no longer afraid of disappointing people. "Mom, why didn't you answer your phone? And why wouldn't my key work?" She pushed past me into the living room, her energy filling the space with the kind of urgency that suggested crisis, that transformed every conversation into an emergency requiring immediate attention and complete capitulation. "We need to talk about your financial situation. I've been doing some research, and there are programs for seniors who need help managing their money." I closed the door and engaged the new deadbolt, the sound echoing in the hallway with satisfying finality. "Would you like some tea?" "Tea?" "Mom, I'm serious. You can't just change your locks without telling anyone. What if there's an emergency? What if something happens to you? What if we need to get in?" The questions multiplied like arguments in an echo chamber, each one building on the assumption that my safety required her access, that my independence was inherently dangerous. I walked to the kitchen and put the kettle on, grateful for the familiar ritual that kept my hands steady and gave my voice time to find its proper register. Sarah followed, her questions continuing their relentless multiplication. Why had I changed the locks? Why wasn't I returning calls? Why was I being so secretive about everything? Why couldn't I understand that she was only trying to help? "Sugar or honey?" I asked, reaching for the tea tray. "Mom, are you listening to me? I'm trying to help you. Dad always said you weren't good with money, and now that he's gone, you need someone to make sure you don't make any major mistakes." The kettle began its quiet whistle, and I poured water over the tea leaves with the same care I might use for surgery. Dad always said. The familiar incantation, designed to end discussion before it could begin, to invoke an authority that transcended my own experience or judgment. I had spent 37 years believing that Richard's opinions carried more weight than my own competence, even in areas where my knowledge exceeded his, where my careful record-keeping had prevented the very financial disasters he claimed to be protecting me from. "Your father," I said, stirring the tea with deliberate slowness, watching the leaves unfurl in the hot water like small flowers blooming in fast motion, "said many things. Not all of them were accurate." Sarah's expression shifted from frustrated to concerned, the look she got when she suspected I might be having some kind of breakdown that would require professional intervention. "Mom, you're acting strange. Maybe you should talk to someone. There are counselors who specialize in helping older people adjust to loss." I poured tea into 2 cups and added a splash of milk to mine, the ritual giving me time to consider my words, to choose them with the same care I might use to select china for a special occasion. The weight of the teapot in my hands, the sound of liquid meeting porcelain, the steam rising in patterns that caught the kitchen light, all of it felt like a form of prayer, a way of blessing the small acts that made up a day. "I'm not lost, Sarah. I'm newly unclaimed." "What does that even mean?" I carried the tea tray to the living room and set it on the coffee table that had anchored this room for 20 years, its surface marked by the rings of countless cups, the small evidence of conversations that had shaped the landscape of our family life. Sarah perched on the edge of the sofa, her body language broadcasting impatience and worry in equal measure, her attention already fractured by the possibility of more urgent demands elsewhere. I settled into my chair, Richard's chair, though I no longer thought of it that way, and took a sip of my tea. "It means I'm learning the difference between being alone and being free." We sat in silence for several minutes, the only sound the gentle tick of the mantel clock that had belonged to my mother, the steady rhythm marking time that belonged to me now rather than to everyone else's schedules. Sarah checked her phone twice, her attention drawn to messages that seemed more pressing than the conversation we were supposedly having. I watched the steam rise from my teacup and tried to remember the last time I had sat in my own living room without feeling the need to justify my presence there, without calculating whether my occupation of space was preventing someone else from being more comfortable. "I don't understand what's happening to you," Sarah finally said, her voice carrying the particular frustration of someone who had always been able to manage me and was discovering that management was no longer welcome. Ever since Dad died, you've been different. Distant. And now you're changing locks and making cryptic comments about being unclaimed. It's like you're turning into someone I don't recognize. Silence is not surrender when it's chosen. I set my teacup on its saucer with the soft click of porcelain meeting porcelain, the sound as final as a period at the end of a sentence. Perhaps the person you're recognizing is someone who was always here, just quieter. Sarah stood abruptly, her frustration finally overwhelming her attempt at patient concern. Fine. If you want to shut everyone out and make mysterious decisions without consulting your family, that's your choice. But don't expect me to stick around to watch you make mistakes. She walked to the front door and tried the handle, forgetting about the new deadbolt. The small delay gave her words time to settle in the air between us, their ultimatum hanging like smoke from a fire that had been burning for years. I followed her slowly, my tea still warm in my hands, in no hurry to end a conversation that had clarified so much about the nature of our relationship. Sarah, I said as I turned the lock to let her out. I love you. That hasn't changed and never will. But love doesn't require me to live my life according to your fears. She stared at me for a long moment, her face cycling through expressions I couldn't quite read, surprise, hurt, anger, something that might have been recognition. Then she walked to her car without looking back, her heels clicking against the concrete in sharp, angry punctuation marks that faded as she drove away. I closed the door and engaged the lock, the sound no longer foreign but familiar, like a word I had been trying to remember for decades. The next morning brought Walter Henderson at my garden gate, holding a paper bag that smelled of fresh bread and wearing the kind of smile that suggested he had been planning this visit for days. Walter lived in the blue house next door and had been quietly helpful since Richard's funeral, bringing in my garbage cans when I forgot, clearing snow from my walkway without being asked, nodding hello when we encountered each other in our respective yards. He was perhaps 75, with hands that knew their way around gardens and simple repairs, and the patient demeanor of someone who had learned to value small kindnesses over grand gestures. Good morning, Helen, he said, his voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who had given up cigarettes but not the morning coffee that had accompanied them. I was making bread yesterday and, well, it seems I'm still cooking for two even though it's been 3 years since Margaret passed. Thought you might like a loaf. I unlatched the gate and accepted the bag, warm against my palms. The bread was wrapped in a clean dish towel, the kind of practical thoughtfulness that spoke of decades spent caring for someone else, of understanding that the presentation of a gift mattered as much as the gift itself. That's very kind of you, Walter. Would you like to come in for coffee? We sat at my kitchen table while the bread cooled between us, its crust crackling softly as it settled. Walter drank his coffee black and spoke about small things, the marigolds that had surprised him by blooming again after the first frost, the young family that had moved into the Hendricks place down the street, the way the neighborhood had changed since we had both first moved here 20-something years ago. His conversation was comfortable, undemanding, the kind of talk that filled space without requiring anything in return. Helen, he said eventually, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug like it was anchoring him to something important. I hope you don't mind my saying, but you seem different lately. Lighter, somehow. Like you've set down something heavy. I considered his observation while I sliced the bread, the knife moving through the golden crust with satisfying resistance. Walter was the kind of man who noticed things, the way flowers responded to different kinds of care, the subtle changes in people's faces that suggested internal weather patterns shifting. He had been married to Margaret for 48 years before cancer took her, and had spent the time since learning to live alone without becoming bitter about it. I've been doing some reorganizing, I said, offering him a slice spread with the honey butter I made every fall from honey I bought at the farmer's market and butter I churned myself in a small glass jar. Financial things, mostly. Trying to put my life in order. Good for you. Margaret always said a woman should know her own money, even when she's married. especially when she's married. He took a bite of the bread and honey, his expression showing appreciation for both the food and the conversation, the simple pleasure of sharing something homemade on a morning that belonged to no one but themselves. Are your children supportive of your independence? I laughed, a sound that surprised me with its lightness, its lack of bitterness despite the complexity of the situation it described. Sarah thinks I'm having some kind of breakdown. She's worried I'll make mistakes without supervision. Walter nodded with the understanding of someone who had raised children and watched them struggle to let their parents be adults, to accept that growing older didn't automatically mean growing incompetent. My son wanted me to move to one of those senior communities after Margaret died. Said it wasn't safe for an old man to live alone in a big house. Took me 6 months to convince him that I was old, not incompetent. We spent the afternoon working in my small backyard garden, Walter helping me prepare the flower beds for winter while I divided the lilac bushes that had grown too large for their space. The work was satisfying in the way that physical labor can be when it's chosen rather than required, when it serves your own vision rather than someone else's expectations. My hands in the soil, the sharp scent of lilac wood as we cut back the overgrown branches, the easy conversation that flowed between people who had both learned to value quiet companionship over constant entertainment. Repair begins in the soil under our fingernails, I said as we washed up at the garden spigot, watching the dark earth swirl away down the drain. The water was cold against our hands, and the late afternoon light was beginning to take on the golden quality that made even ordinary moments feel touched by something special. Walter smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that suggested decades of finding joy in simple things, of understanding that happiness was often less about dramatic events than about paying attention to small daily gifts. Margaret used to say that gardening was just another word for hope. You dig in the dirt because you believe in next spring. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with the good stationery I had been saving for important correspondence and began a letter I would never send. The paper was cream-colored, with a subtle watermark that caught the light, the kind of stationery I had bought years ago for thank you notes and formal occasions that had never quite seemed formal enough to justify using it. Dear Sarah, there are things I need to say that are too large for conversation and too true for argument. I am writing them here not because I expect them to change anything between us, but because some truths require the permanence of ink on paper to become real, to exist outside the immediate heat of disagreement and disappointment. You asked me why I changed the locks, why I've become distant, why I seem like someone you don't recognize. The answer is that I am someone you never knew. For 68 years, I have been editing myself to fit other people's comfort, speaking in a voice pitched to avoid conflict, making myself smaller so that others could feel larger. The woman you knew as your mother was a carefully constructed performance, and I am tired of the show. I loved your father. I love you. But love does not require self-erasure, and I have been disappearing by degrees for so long that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to take up space in my own life. When you told me to stop wasting money on myself, you meant to be helpful. You meant to protect me from my own supposed poor judgment. But what you actually did was reveal how thoroughly I had taught you that my happiness was optional, that my pleasure was selfish, that my choices needed to justify themselves to a committee of other people's fears. I am not having a breakdown, though I understand why it might appear that way. I am having a breakthrough, the kind that comes when you finally understand that asking permission to exist in your own life is its own form of madness. For 40 years, I have been apologizing for wanting things, explaining my choices, defending my right to occupy space and spend money and make decisions based on my own preferences rather than other people's budgets. This is not punishment for the years of being managed and diminished. This is not revenge for the countless small humiliations of being treated as less competent than I actually am. This is repair. The quiet, careful work of rebuilding a life that was damaged not by cruelty but by the slow erosion of constantly accommodating other people's comfort at the expense of my own. I will always be your mother. I will always love your children. I will always be grateful for the family we have built together. But I will no longer apologize for wanting things, buying things, choosing things that bring me joy without calculating their impact on everyone else's budget, schedule, or opinion. I will no longer ask permission to live fully in my own house, to spend my own money, to make my own mistakes. This is not about you, though I know it will feel that way. This is about me finally understanding that I have value that doesn't depend on my usefulness to other people, that my worth isn't measured by how little trouble I cause or how successfully I anticipate and accommodate everyone else's needs. With love and newly discovered boundaries, Mom. I read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in the envelope that would never be addressed, never mailed, never delivered. Some truths were meant to be written rather than spoken, shaped by the discipline of putting pen to paper rather than unleashed in the heat of conversation. The act of writing had clarified thoughts that had been swimming in my consciousness for months, given form to feelings that had been too large and formless to understand. I placed the sealed envelope in the folder with my trust documents, where it would serve as a record of the day I learned to speak my own name without asking permission. Forgiveness sometimes looks like unaddressed mail. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the kitchen window, watching the last light fade from October sky. Tomorrow I would call the community college about the part-time bookkeeping positions they sometimes had available. Not because I needed the money, but because I missed the satisfaction of balancing other people's numbers while maintaining perfect clarity about my own. Next week I would plan a small trip, maybe the train to the coast, where I could sit by windows and read books without anyone commenting on their cost or practicality. The steam from my teacup caught the lamplight, creating small ghosts that dissolved as quickly as they formed. I had spent 40 years learning to be invisible, and it would take time to practice visibility. But time was something I had in abundance now, along with the growing understanding that every day spent accommodating other people's fears was a day borrowed from my own possibilities. I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began making a different kind of list, one that belonged entirely to me. Places I want to visit. Books I want to read. Things I want to learn. Ways I want to spend Tuesday afternoons. Each item was a small rebellion against the idea that wanting things was selfish, that pleasure required justification, that happiness was something I could only have after everyone else's needs had been met. The morning routine that had once felt like obligation now carried the weight of ritual. I rose with the sun, put the kettle on, and sat by the kitchen window while my tea steeped. The view was the same, Walter's blue house, the maple tree that dropped its leaves in dramatic yellow piles each October, the quiet street where people lived lives that intersected briefly at mailboxes and property lines. But my relationship to the view had changed. I no longer saw it as the frame for someone else's life, it was the landscape of my own daily territory. I had been practicing independence for 6 weeks when the call came from Dr. Chen's office. Patricia, the woman who had replaced me 5 years ago, was moving to Arizona with her husband, and they needed someone familiar with their system to fill in temporarily. Would I be interested in working 15 hours a week through the end of the year? Yes, I said, the word arriving without hesitation, without the need to consult anyone else's schedule or opinion. I would very much like that. I returned to the office on a Tuesday morning that smelled like autumn leaves and possibility. The dental practice occupied a small building on Elm Street, with wooden floors that creaked comfortably underfoot and windows that faced the town square where people moved with the particular purpose of mid-morning errands. Chen had updated the computer system since my retirement, but the bones of the work remained familiar: insurance forms, appointment scheduling, the careful mathematics of keeping a small business solvent. Mrs. Davidson, Dr. Chen said, his face creasing into the kind of smile that suggested genuine pleasure rather than politeness. It's wonderful to have you back. The books have been challenging since Patricia left. I spent the morning reacquainting myself with the rhythms of work that had once felt like second nature. The phone calls from insurance companies, the careful dance of scheduling patients around school pickup times and lunch breaks, the satisfaction of reconciling accounts that balanced to the penny. My hands remembered the keyboard shortcuts, the filing system, the particular way Dr. Chen preferred his correspondence formatted. By afternoon, I felt the familiar competence settling back into my shoulders like a coat that had been tailored specifically for me. This was work I was good at, work that required the kind of attention to detail that had once been criticized as perfectionism but was actually just thoroughness applied with care. When the day ended, I drove home with the windows down despite the October chill, the cool air carrying the scent of burning leaves and the knowledge that I would return tomorrow to work that valued my capabilities rather than questioning them. Sarah called that evening while I was preparing dinner for one, a small chicken breast with herbs from the garden Walter had helped me plant, rice pilaf made from a mix that would have once been considered wasteful but now felt practical. The phone rang 3 times before I decided to answer it, allowing myself the luxury of choice rather than the automatic response that had once governed my relationship with other people's demands. "Mom, I heard you're working again." Her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone trying not to trigger another difficult conversation, but I could hear the underlying current of concern, the assumption that my choices needed to be examined for signs of crisis or breakdown. "Mrs. Patterson saw you at Dr. Chen's office and mentioned it to someone at the grocery store." The speed of small-town information networks never ceased to amaze me. In a city, my comings and goings would be anonymous, unremarkable. Here, every choice was potential news, every deviation from expected behavior worthy of discussion over coffee and speculation in the produce aisle. "Yes, I'm helping them out temporarily." Patricia moved away, and they needed someone familiar with their system. "But Mom, you're retired. Why would you want to go back to work? Is this about money?" "Because if you're having financial problems, we can help. David got that promotion, and we could, Sarah." I interrupted gently, the way I might redirect a child who was heading toward a busy street without looking both ways. "I'm working because I want to work. Because I'm good at it and I missed it. Not everything is about money or problems or needing rescue." A long pause, filled with the sound of her children's voices in the background and the television playing something with animated music. I could picture her kitchen, toys scattered across the counter, homework spread on the table, the controlled chaos of a household where multiple people's needs competed for attention at every moment. "I just worry that you're taking on too much. At your age, you should be slowing down, not starting new projects." Asterisk at your age. Asterisk the phrase hung between us like a curtain drawn across possibility. I was 68, not 98. My mind was sharp, my hands steady, my energy sufficient for the small adventures I was finally allowing myself to imagine. But to Sarah, crossing the threshold of retirement meant entering a realm where desire was selfish and capability was always suspect. "I appreciate your concern," I said, the words shaped by the diplomacy I had learned over decades of managing other people's emotions. "But I'm quite happy with my decision." After I hung up the phone, I made myself a pot of Earl Grey and carried it to the living room, where I had been reading a travel book about small coastal towns in Maine. The photographs showed weathered fishing boats and lighthouses painted white against gray sky, bed and breakfasts with rooms that faced the ocean and served breakfast at small tables set with mismatched china. I had never traveled alone, never made a reservation in my own name for a place I had chosen simply because it looked peaceful in a guidebook photograph. I marked several pages with small slips of paper and made notes in the margins, train schedules, phone numbers, the names of towns that sounded like poetry, Camden, Bar Harbor, Kennebunkport. Next month, when the temporary work at Dr. Chen's office ended, I would take a small trip. Not a grand adventure that would inspire worry or commentary, just a quiet journey to a place where no one knew my history or my children's opinions about my choices. The train to Portland left at 7:45 on a Thursday morning in early December, carrying me north through landscapes that grew progressively more spare and beautiful. I had packed a single small suitcase and a book I had been wanting to read, a memoir about a woman who had learned to sail in her 70s, and claimed a window seat that faced east toward the ocean I couldn't yet see but could smell in the salt-tinged air that rushed through the station doors. Asterisk I wasn't lost, I was newly unclaimed. Asterisk the words came to me as the train pulled away from familiar territory, carrying me toward 3 days of meals I would choose, walks I would take at my own pace, Conversations with strangers who would see me simply as a woman traveling alone rather than someone's mother or widow or responsibility. The freedom felt almost dizzying, like the sensation of standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing that the drop below was actually an invitation to fly. I had reserved a room at a small inn overlooking Casco Bay, the kind of place that served afternoon tea in a parlor with windows that faced the water. The woman at the front desk was perhaps my age, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and the kind of competent warmth that suggested decades of welcoming solitary travelers who had stories they didn't need to tell. "First time in Maine?" she asked as she handed me an old-fashioned metal key, the kind that required actual turning rather than electronic scanning. "First time traveling alone," I admitted, surprising myself with the honesty that seemed to accompany this new version of myself, this woman who was learning to tell the truth without apologizing for it. She smiled with recognition, the expression of someone who had seen other women my age discover the particular pleasure of being responsible only for their own comfort. "Well, you've picked a good place for it. The ocean doesn't ask questions, and the lobster doesn't judge." My room faced east, with windows that framed the harbor like a painting that changed with the light. I spent the afternoon walking the narrow streets of the old port, breathing air that tasted of salt and possibility. The town was small enough to navigate easily but large enough to hold surprises, bookshops that stayed open late, restaurants where single diners were welcomed rather than pitted, benches that faced the water where I could sit and read without anyone asking if I was waiting for someone. In the evening, I ate dinner alone at a restaurant where the waiter called me ma'am without condescension and brought me a glass of wine I hadn't had to justify to anyone. The other diners seemed to be locals mostly, people who lived here year-round and understood that dinner could be a pleasure rather than a chore, that taking time to enjoy food was a form of self-respect rather than self-indulgence. I wrote postcards I would never send, took photographs with a camera I had bought myself without consulting anyone about the expense, and fell asleep to the sound of water moving against the shore in rhythms older than worry. For 3 days, I was responsible only for my own comfort, my own schedule, my own small pleasures. I discovered that I was excellent company for myself when I stopped apologizing for my presence. On the second day, I took a boat tour that lasted 4 hours and taught me the names of seabirds I had never thought to identify. The guide was a woman about my age who had been born here, had raised her children here, and had recently started this business after her divorce. "Best thing I ever did," she said as we watched seals sunbathing on a rocky outcrop. "Turns out I know more about this coast than I ever gave myself credit for." The train ride home carried me back toward the landscape of my regular life, but something fundamental had shifted during those 3 days beside the ocean. I had practiced being a woman who traveled alone and discovered that I was still myself, only larger somehow, as if I had been holding my breath for decades and had finally remembered how to exhale. I returned to work at Dr. Chen's office for the final 2 weeks of my temporary assignment, my competence sharpened by the reminder that I was choosing to be there rather than hiding there. When patients complimented my efficiency or Dr. Chen thanked me for catching errors that could have been expensive, I accepted their appreciation without deflecting it or sharing credit with people who hadn't contributed to the work. The last Friday of my assignment, Dr. Chen asked if I would consider staying on permanently, perhaps 20 hours a week. "You bring a calmness to the office that we've missed," he said. "And frankly, your attention to detail has saved us from several significant billing errors." I thanked him and asked for the weekend to consider his offer. Not because I needed to consult anyone else, but because important decisions deserved the space to breathe before becoming final. I drove home through the early December afternoon, the winter light already fading toward the promise of snow, thinking about the pleasure of being valued for skills I had spent decades developing, of being seen as competent rather than fragile. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with the folder that had grown to contain the documents of my new life. The trust papers, signed and filed. The unsigned letter to Sarah, preserved like a pressed flower between pages of legal importance. The postcards from Maine, stamps unattached, addresses unwritten. A small collection of evidence that I had spent the autumn learning to live deliberately rather than accidentally. I opened the folder and removed a sheet of paper, the same cream-colored stationery I had used for the letter I would never mail. This time, I would write something I intended to keep rather than hide, something that would serve as a record rather than a secret. December 15 today I was offered a job that I am qualified for, that I enjoy, and that pays me fairly for skills I have spent decades developing. I was offered this position not because someone felt sorry for me or thought I needed supervision, but because I do the work well. Today I realized that I have spent 6 months quietly rebuilding my life from the inside out, and that the reconstruction is complete enough to stand on its own. I have changed my locks, opened my own accounts, taken a trip alone, and returned to work not because I had to but because I wanted to. Today I understood that the word waste as my daughter used it was never about money. It was about permission, her belief that my happiness required external authorization, that my choices needed to justify themselves to a committee of other people's expectations. I wasted nothing on the tea and tart that October afternoon. I wasted nothing on the locks or the trip or the small daily pleasures I have been allowing myself. What would have been truly wasteful was continuing to live as if my contentment were optional, as if my pleasure were selfish, as if my happiness were somehow less important than everyone else's comfort. I will take the job. I will continue to travel when I want to. I will buy good tea and books I haven't been assigned to read and flowers for my table because they're beautiful rather than practical. I will love my daughter and grandchildren without requiring their approval of my choices. I will waste none of my remaining years on the exhausting labor of making myself smaller to accommodate other people's fears. I signed the document with my full name and placed it at the front of the folder, where it would serve as a manifesto rather than a confession. Then I put the kettle on and made myself a pot of Earl Grey, the expensive kind that came in tins and tasted like the calm certainty of choosing what I wanted without having to explain why I wanted it. The steam rose from my cup in patterns that caught the lamplight and dissolved into the warm air of my kitchen. Outside, the first snow of winter had begun to fall, each flake distinct and purposeful in the glow of the streetlights. I sat by the window and watched the world transform itself into something cleaner and more spacious, the familiar landscape made new by the simple act of weather deciding to change. Tea, warm and exactly enough. That phrase would become the title of the small routine I had been perfecting all autumn, the morning ritual that began with the kettle's whistle and ended with the satisfying weight of a full cup warming my hands. Not too much tea, not too little. Not too hot, not too cool. Measured and chosen and sufficient unto itself, like the life I was learning to live. The reflection in the window showed a woman I was learning to recognize, gray-haired, green-eyed, wearing a sweater she had bought because she liked the color rather than because it was practical or on sale or approved by anyone else. A woman who looked like someone capable of making good decisions, living alone without loneliness, spending money on small pleasures without apology. I called Dr. Chen the next morning and accepted his offer, my voice steady as I negotiated a schedule that would give me time for the other things I was learning to want. 20 hours a week of work that valued my competence. Time to read books that served no purpose beyond my own curiosity. Mornings for the garden Walter and I were planning for spring. Afternoons for tea and travel guides and the slow pleasure of making choices based on my own preferences. Walter came by that afternoon with another loaf of bread and an invitation to help him plan the vegetable garden he wanted to put in next year. We spent the evening at my kitchen table with graph paper and seed catalogs, designing raised beds that would be easier on our backs and more productive than the haphazard plots we had both been tending. You know, he said as we calculated how many tomato plants would fit in a 4x8 bed, Margaret always said the best gardens were planted by people who had time to pay attention to what they were growing. I looked up from the seed catalog where I had been marking varieties of herbs I wanted to try. Do you think we have that time now? I think we're learning how to make time for what matters, he said, and I realized that this was perhaps the most accurate description of what I had been doing all autumn, not finding time, which suggested it was hidden somewhere waiting to be discovered, but making time, which required the more difficult work of deciding what mattered and what didn't. The snow continued to fall, covering the garden where we would plant our hopeful seeds in a few months, transforming the familiar into something fresh and unmarked. Tomorrow would bring another morning tea, another day of work that I had chosen, another small opportunity to practice the art of living deliberately. But tonight, I would sit by my window with my tea and my contentment, practicing the art of being enough, for myself, by myself, without needing anyone else's permission to exist fully in my own life. The arithmetic of respect, I had learned, was surprisingly simple. You gave yourself the same consideration you gave others, asked for the same courtesy you extended, expected the same kindness you offered. Asterisk I wasted none on them, because nothing is wasted on me. Asterisk the words settled into the quiet kitchen like a benediction, like the last line of a story that had taken 68 years to write and 6 months to edit into something true. I had learned, finally, the difference between sacrifice and generosity, between love and accommodation, between being alone and being free. I had discovered that dignity was not something other people granted you but something you practiced daily, like a language you learned by speaking it aloud until it became natural. The tea was warm and exactly enough. The snow was beautiful and required nothing from me but appreciation. I was 68 years old and finally, completely, my own. Tomorrow I would wake up in a house where I controlled the locks, spend money I had earned on things that brought me joy, make decisions based on my own judgment rather than other people's fears. Tonight, I would finish my tea and wash my cup and turn off the lights, performing the small rituals of a woman who had learned that taking care of herself was not selfish but necessary, not wasteful but wise. The reflection in the dark window would show a face that belonged entirely to me, wearing an expression of quiet satisfaction that needed no one else's approval to be real.